Hey, so good afternoon, evening, morning, whatever it is for you. Welcome to the webcast. I'm going to talk a little bit about ransomware, about cases that we investigated, what they have in common, which techniques worked out pretty well, and which didn't. So I'm going to align a little bit to some of the questions that I got over the last few weeks, month, whatever. So obviously a lot of you guys are doing incident response in ransomware cases right now, and I don't think that will end anytime soon. If I get any glitches or anything like that, I'm really sorry for that. So the whole setup is entirely new. It's, a little bit complex to keep all of that running, but I hope I'll manage to do that. Well, ransomware, let's get right started. So there are obviously quite a few groups that use ransomware out there. They make a ton of money actually, and well, they make our lives hard sometimes, and especially our clients' lives, to be a little bit more precise there. So let's look at some of these groups there. We have MacCop, for example. They have been, quite annoying over the last couple of weeks in the center of Europe. We have the Vice Society, for example. That's another one. We do have Grief. Grief is one of the emerging groups right now. They are quite active in Central Europe right now. And I also saw some US targets there on their leak site. If you're interested in getting a list of some of the leak sites, then please just post it into the chat, and I will share it with you. I just don't want to make it fully public here. Okay, so let's get right into it. Maybe to get some idea about the timing, I will take about 15 to 20 minutes to walk through the most common questions. And after that, I will switch over to the chat. In the current setup, I'm not able to see the chat right now. That will change for the next webcast, but for now, I cannot see the chat while I'm sharing some sort of presentation. Okay, so just to make you aware, but if you got any questions, then just please post them into the chat and I will get back to them right after I finished the presentation part of things here. Okay, so how does it usually start? That was one of the questions, right? So how do they realize, how do your clients realize that they have been hacked by a ransomware group? Well, I think that's, for one, a straightforward response. Well, probably because they're encrypted. But to be honest, it's a bit more difficult than that, because I would say about a third of our cases, the client realizes that something bad is going on before they are encrypted. And that's the kind of cases that are way more difficult, because in these cases, you are playing against the clock. Well, you're doing that in the other cases as well. But in this case, it's really playing against the attacker, while in the other case, when they already have been encrypted, it's more like a race against rebuilding the whole infrastructure, keeping them productional or making them productional again as an organization. So in that regard, I want to focus a little bit more on the cases where the organization realized that something bad is going on before they were encrypted. So what is the number one for us? I mean, obviously it's something that's not totally representative, but talking to my colleagues, I think they saw a pretty similar picture. So maybe it's something you could be looking for as well. So most of the times we have two different vectors into the network by those groups. So one of them is some sort of or form of phishing. The other one is, and that's the more common one, some sort of external access infrastructure, like an RDP access that was left open to the internet without multi-factor. Sometimes the same for Citrix, VPN, all kind of external infrastructure, mostly not secured by multi-factor. So that's how they get in, right? But that's usually not the point when they get detected. So usually they get detected one out of two ways. So either someone is looking at the AV logs and sees some detections. There is rarely ever a case that we investigate when we look into all the AV logs of the whole infrastructure where we don't see one or the other trace of the attacker. The problem is just no one looks at those logs in normal operations, and for that reason they go undetected for a long while. The other instance when they get detected is when they do something that causes some capacity issues. So one of these, the reasons for that could, for example, be if they compile data on one host and they just fill up the hard drive of that host, that might be something that your capacity monitoring will alert on, right? The other thing is high CPU load on certain machines is also something that organizations or administrators might recognize. So I remember a case, for example, where they did not get encrypted in the end, which is good for them, but it was a strong battle with the attacker because they were on the brink of encrypting and the whole organization. And they only got detected because the CPU load on a domain controller got pretty high compared to normal situations. And that also in a time where no one was really logging in, no one was doing anything on a domain controller. And that tipped the administrator off. That administrator looked at the machine and saw that there was an interesting session with a user that the administrator was not aware of. So that's one of the situations that we see over and over again, because in many of these cases they add new users. So that's probably one of the first hints. If you are faced with a group like this, you probably want to look at the users that they might have added. So just look into the users that have been recently added, because usually those groups don't linger around for very long. So all of those dwell times that we were talking about, like maybe 3 or 4 years ago, when we said, okay, the typical dwell time is like 100 days, 200 days, whatever. Well, that's gone. That's over. The fastest encryption of a network, and that was not a super small network, it was about 8,000 hosts. And in this network, it only took them 23 hours from initial breach via exfiltration to full encryption of the network, just 23 hours. So they didn't really have a lot of time to react, so they didn't react in the end. Okay, so this is very important to understand that we are really talking about some timing constraints here. Okay, so you have to be fast there. The other thing there is by using their own user, they're doing us a favor, right? Because obviously it's easier for us to find them. Because going back to that example with the domain controller where the CPU load was going very high, well, it was quite easy to find that session, right? To see who was running that software that was causing that CPU load. In that case, by the way, it was a network scanner that was not programmed too well, and that created some CPU spikes. And the administrator saw that this network scanner has been started, and he saw the user that started that server, he didn't know that user. And that's how all that went on from there. Okay? So now we are in that situation where we get to a client and we see, okay, there is really something bad going on. We usually get one machine, which is typically not patient zero, right? Sometimes it is patient zero, but not always. So one of the first things you can do before they even give you some sort of access to the network is using online search engines like Showdown, for example, to figure out if that organization had some sort of publicly available access infrastructure that does not require the user to use a second factor. You can do that without any access to the network, because that already might give an indication on how they would have gotten in, right? Or could have gotten in. So that's important to understand. The more you can do before you even engage, the better it is for you, the better prepared you are. So once you are starting all that, what are the priorities? That's also a question I get a lot, because resource management and incident response is super critical. And I still see organizations and big organizations doing incident response that just keep throwing bodies at a problem. That's not really how it works, right? So you really want to do some very precise resource management. And if you want resources, you have to align the resource consumption to some sort of a goal, right? So that's how you do resource management, because otherwise you're wasting resources. And to get precise goals, you need to get your priorities straight. And there are actually, like 2 different approaches to that. One is the more management-like approach, where it's about, okay, how do we see that whole topic? Like, how do we get this organization up on their feet again very quickly from an organizational perspective, but as well, there is a technical aspect to it. What do I do first? What do I do last? Which kind of approaches will allow me to get the job done with the least amount of resources and the least amount of time consumed? because that's what saves us in the end. And from a management perspective, there are three priorities. Priority number one is keep the value chain going if it's still going. I mean, obviously, if you are not encrypted at this point, usually the value chain is still going. So if it's a factory, they might still be producing. If it's some sort of consultancy, they might still be able to write their emails, to have their calls and all that. The second situation is if they have been encrypted already and some major systems are down for this reason. In that case, you need to recover the value chain. So all the actions you take should be aligned to that value chain. So in other terms, if they want you to look into some systems and figure out if there are still backdoors in those systems, well, you probably have some sort of priority, which systems to look into at first. And naturally, that's something, that kind of priority is something you would expect the client to give to you, but that is not realistic. So usually when you get in situations like that, the client will be in crazy chicken mode for the first couple of hours, or in the worst case for the first couple of days or weeks. So you need to be in control of that, right? You need to help them out, not just from an investigation perspective. So the times where incident responders were just investigating something, those times are over. I mean, many organizations didn't realize that by now, and they're still just focused mainly only on the investigation. But to be honest, the organizations are usually not at all interested in the investigation results. They're interested in minimizing their losses. The investigation can help to do that, but there's no reason for the investigation to finish on its own. It always has to align to some sort of business goal there, right? So that's the reason. Priority number two is, in most of the ransomware cases today, data has been exfiltrated at the point when they encrypt the network, because that's sort of the second hit tactic. So the first hit is the encryption, and the second hit, if your client won't pay, is that they will release data, right? So on one hand, they will probably, if you get in touch with the attackers, they will tell you what they supposedly get. They will never give you everything they got. They will give you some samples, but not everything. So that means that it's still very important to the client to understand what really leaked out of their network, to make an educated guess on if they need to pay or they don't need to pay, right? Because I'm totally against funding those criminals, right? That's for sure. But I'm even more against killing a company just for the sake of not supporting the criminals. That's also something I wouldn't do, right? So if this is the only kind of solution, in the end they probably have to pay. That's just what it is. But you can support them by better helping them to understand what the attacker has, because maybe it's not that super important. And the funny thing is, because those ransomware attacks are so widespread today, the value of the data they put online is usually not that big anymore as it used to be, because there are so many leaks all over the place that it sort of gets normal, right? So probably all your personal data has been leaked over and over again already, right? So that's not something that's very unrealistic, to be honest, okay? And so that's priority number two, that future exposure, right? So what will they be coming back with if I set up my network again without their help? And the third thing is, how do I make sure that they don't get back easily into our network? And there are two things that I need to figure out for that. Well, obviously, how they got into the network in the first place. I need to basically cover that hole. And the second thing is, I need to figure out if they still have presence in form of some bridgeheads in the network, because oftentimes they do, and that's very important to understand. So these are my main from the management perspective, right? So to get them running again very quickly. The other thing is, how do I prioritize the technical part of the investigation? Well, first of all, if I'm talking about resource management and I want to invest my resources wisely, I better have some sort of a plan how I can spend those resources, right? So in a nutshell, if what I can do is the store and my resources are the money that I have, I don't want to go into the store and have a selection of hundreds of different things I could do. I'd rather have a selection of like 3 or 4 different things that I can buy, and those would be the best things that would fit my current situation. So what you need to do in there is to basically understand what kind of techniques you have. So there are techniques out there that help you to cover a large organization, all of the machines of the organizations. Then there are techniques that you can apply to a subset of machines without overwhelming your resources. And then there are techniques you can only do on a very, very limited number, like 2 or 3 machines in a network. So that end of the spectrum would usually be something like getting full hard drive images. But to be honest, for most investigations, you don't really need to do that anymore if you have the right tooling in place to do it, to get all the data in other ways. So how do we usually start? That is another question I get a lot. So what are you looking at? So first of all, first and foremost, everything that comes now depends on one thing, and that one thing is visibility. So that means all of the things that I'm going to present to you, I'm going to show you some artifacts, some very easy artifacts. So the artifacts are something that's very well known. If I give you a Windows machine, I'm pretty sure most of you can just get that artifact out of that machine. Now the problem with that is I want to get that out of thousands or tens of thousands or hundreds of thousands of machines, and that's where it gets a little bit difficult. But there are tools out there, and I'll probably do another webcast on that at a later point. That allow you to get that kind of visibility. If you work without visibility, you cannot be faster than the attacker, because the attacker is a choice of like thousands of machines, right? And you don't know which machines the attacker chose, right? So you have to be faster and you have to look into all the machines. So you really need to find all the backdoors, otherwise they will be back in very soon. So what could you be looking at? Well, the thing is, I showed you some of the ransomware groups that we were faced with in the last couple of months, and they are usually not super good, right? They just use off-the-shelf tools, right? But that's totally enough. So they obviously have good resource management as well on their side. But that, on the other hand, means that you don't need super fancy forensic stuff to find them. So let's look into some of the artifacts that you can use. So here are, I just placed some of them. They're coming out of the SANS poster, the SANS Windows Forensics poster. And if you look into the description, you should see a link to that poster. You just need to sign up with your SANS account and you can download them from there. So I totally love that poster. And I actually have them on my door. You can just like see it. Oops, wait, here. At least you can see half of it. And I use that all the times because I can never remember all those paths and stuff that are on that poster. So, okay. So one of the things that most of the groups have in common is they strongly stick to GUI, right? So they use RDP to move laterally. They use GUI-based network scanners to find open shares and all of that, right? So one of the most seen tools in the last couple of cases was the Soft Perfect network scanner that has been around forever, but attackers like to use that because it's super easy to use. It gives you a very nice representation of what it found on the network, so very useful. It's also useful for us because usually they leave the data file lying around, so we as investigators can see what they saw during the investigation. The second useful thing about that is it comes with a license file, and that might help you to track back different attackers, right? Because they are not always the same. So first, we believe that whenever we find the license file, it would all be the same across the different cases. They are not. So you can actually really start tracking some of those license files if you have a collection of these. So very interesting at some point in time. And the third thing when it comes to tools like Network Scanner is that it's a GUI tool. And GUI tools are usually stored, or the last execution of GUI tools in Windows is usually stored in an artifact called user assist. So you can see it on the left-hand side of the screen. The user assist key basically gives you just a list that tells you what was executed and when was the last execution. And as you can see, it's a little bit small maybe on the screen, but it's something that lives in the anti-user det. So that means it also goes back to a user. So if you find a suspicious tool that was executed in your network, you can also track it back to the user who executed it, right? So all you need to have now is you need to have some sort of tool to basically get the user assist keys from all users all across your network. That's step number one. And then you go into the so-called stacking mode. So that means you take the path of the tool and you just like unique them, right? So if, for example, I have cwindowscalc.exe, sorry, cwindows system32 calc.exe, I would have that probably 100,000 times, right? So I only put it in my list once, and maybe put the count of that path to the side, like 10,000, 20,000, whatever. And then I start looking at the low number, low frequency of occurrence, and that tells me the executables that have not been found on many machines for many users. And usually the attacker tools are amongst the tools that are least frequently used, right? By only 1 or 2 users that the attacker have. They don't like execute the network scanner with 10 users, no matter how big that network is, right? So this is very useful to find that. Obviously, it's something that's limited to GUI tools, so if they stick to something on the command line, that will not really help you. But usually there is always some sort or form of GUI tool that they use as well. If it's about tools that are live on the command line only, you can look into the shim cache. So shim cache stacking has been around for a very long time. There are quite a few shim cache parsers that help you. I'm not going into details on what shim cache does, but in a nutshell, at least it gives you a path of all the executables. How do executables get added to the shim cache? Well, either if someone browses to the directory using Explorer, that's number one, or number two is if someone executes a file, then it also gets added to the shim cache. So that's important to understand, and it's super important because it will also work with the UNC path. So for example, if you are on machine A and you execute a file that lives on machine B, so like // machine B $admin /something.exe, it will also show up in the shim cache on the machine A, right? So that's something you don't usually do very often in a network, but attackers tend to do that. So that's important to understand. So this helps us to understand and get what's going on and get some traction. So now in those cases where the attacker stuck to a very specific user or a set of very specific users, I would be interested in what they were interested in, right? So what they wanted to exfiltrate. And for that, I can use shellbacks, for example. So what is a shellback? Well, actually, you can try it out yourself. So if you open an Explorer window in your Windows machine, unfortunately, I only have a, well, actually, fortunately, I only have a Mac here. But if you, in Windows, if you open an Explorer window, you resize it, you place it somewhere on the screen, and you close the window, you open Explorer again, the window will pop up at the same position. And the reason for that is that this is stored in the shellbacks, right? So that gives you positional information, but it also gives you the title of the window. And even though in newer Windows operating systems you do not see that title, you only see the last part of the path, it's still that the object still has the full path. So the shellback will actually give you some sort of a browsing history. And as you can see, it's something that is very useful because it's again in the anti-user dat and in the user class dat. So it's something that basically goes back to the user. So if I know that, for example, an attacker added a user called, well, admin123, for example, I can just use whatever tool I use for my visibility and get all the shellbacks for all machines. And usually you will find 1 or 2 or maybe 3 machines that have more shellbacks than all others. And those are the machines where they were usually iterating through the different shares. Because if you iterate through a share using Explorer, it will also show in there, right? So you understand which directories they have accessed and which not. That can be super important later. And obviously, when you go down that road, there are a few tools that they prefer to exfiltrate data. So usually they do not open something using a web interface to upload stuff, right? So usually they use some sync tools like Megasync, like rclone or whatever. And all of these tools come with their own artifacts. So that is something that can be quite useful there. Now, to the containment. So how do you contain? First of all, what's the difference between containment and remediation? So in the containment phase, usually you try to limit the ability of the attacker to execute. Ideally, in a way that they don't realize you detected them. I give an example. So one of the clients that detected the attack early enough, we were starting to put in some countermeasures. So ideally, I would have loved to cut the whole organization off the internet because that would be the most safe way. But the problem is all of their value chain was built on top of their internet accessibility, or in other terms, on their servers being accessible from the internet, right? So if we would have cut them off, their value chain would have collapsed right away. So that's why we were reluctant to do that at this point. Unfortunately, the administrator in that organization set some steps that tipped the attacker off that we were on them. And what the attackers did is they immediately changed the password of all domain administrator accounts. So that strongly limited the ability of the organization to react. Fortunately, we already had our agents rolled out, so we also had an agent on some of the domain controllers, so we could just reset the passwords and we were in again. But at this point, we had to decide to cut off the whole organization of the internet, even though the value chain was affected. But we figured we could set or get them up and running very quickly that way, rather than allowing the attacker to encrypt the network. That would have been the bigger problem. So when you contain, make sure you only do steps that seem to be normal to the attacker, right? So for example, if you switch down single servers, well, that's something that happens depending on the time of the day, obviously. The second thing is, if you switch off core infrastructure, that's something that might tip the attacker off. And usually they have some bridgeheads into your network and they start working with it. And in that case, we could totally see at the point when they detected that we were on them, how they started to add additional bridgeheads, right, on additional machines. So they were really in panic mode at this point. So in containment, be sure to limit their ability to execute. You can just make sure that, for example, you cut certain machines off the internet. You can probably turn down the traffic limit. You can use some traffic shaping to do that. It always depends on what kind of means that organization has. You can kill one or the other session. I mean, that happens, right? So to the remediation part of it, to remediate cleanly, you really need to understand the attack. You need to know all the bridgeheads. You need to find every presence the attacker has into the network, and you need to find patient zero. You need to figure out how they entered the network in the first place. Before that, remediation is not really remediation, because they will be coming back very quickly. And that's not your goal of remediation, right? So as long as you do not have that kind of information, you definitely need to work longer to figure out what's going on. And we will definitely have some more information on that, and I'll get back to that in a moment. So let me just switch back. So this is the point where I'm not totally sure how to do that, like this, okay? Okay, so usually it's very tough to go through those kind of, wait, my mouse is gone crap. Usually it's very tough to go through these kind of investigations if you do not have a battle plan and you do not have some sort of repeatable thing. So that's also something that I'm gonna elaborate a little bit more on next week, because we put some of that stuff, some of that resource management in the 608 class. The first beta is gonna be next week, well, the week after next week, and on the 9th, I believe. And I think it's important that people in our trade get a little bit more focused on resource management and on a more streamlined incident response process, right? And I'm not talking about working on a ticket in a streamlined process. I'm really talking about big cases where whole infrastructures are hit by something. So Adam put in a question. Hi, Adam. How often would you say you identify backdoors or secondary access methods being left behind by ransomware actors? Actually, very frequently. I'm just not sure most of the times if they just left it there because they didn't care to clean up, or if they left it there for a reason. So what I find is funny, and that's a good question because of that. I mean, I would say usually what I expect from most of the ransomware actors is something like Cobalt Strike or Metasploit, right? But there is quite a trend recently that they fall back to other tools like, for example, AnyDesk. So we see a ton of AnyDesk. And just recently, I saw another remote computer management tool. I forgot the name, to be honest. And they used it in combination with AnyDesk. So on most machines where they really worked on the attackers, they placed AnyDesk, right? But they had very few machines, like 1 or 2 machines, where they had that other solution, right? It's pretty much the same like AnyDesk, TeamViewer, and all of that, BoomGar. all of those remote management tools, but they had another one, and that they never used that, right? So they never ever logged in using that. They just placed it there. They installed it, but they never used it. And they even used a different user to install that. And that was very funny because I figured, well, that's probably their fallback solution, right? So if we figure out they're using AnyDesk and we're killing all the AnyDesk instances, that's their way of getting back to the network, right? So this is what we figured there. I don't know if it's true, but well, that's what it is. How did we find that? Well, quite easy. It's a GUI program, so user assist. And if that doesn't work, well, there are quite a few other artifacts that you can use to figure that out. So quite easy. If you don't have any more questions, I plan to do that more often and give you that kind of information, because the problem is I was trying to push out a few videos, right, to explain certain things. But the amount of time that goes into preparing those videos and cutting them, the animations and all that, are far more than what it takes to prepare a webcast like that, even though it also takes a bit of time to prepare. So I think that's the more convenient way to push out what I have to say and maybe help you out in your investigations. So thanks for watching, and well, I'll be back in, well, maybe a week or two. I'll probably wait until the first run of the 608 class is over. But see you there. And Adam, who posted there, I put it on video now, so we have it in recording. You are already committed to doing a webcast together with me, so looking forward to that as well. So have a good rest of the day, no matter what time it is for you. And I'll be back on the webcast. Thanks for watching. And if you got any questions, you can still put it in the comments. I'll leave the recording of the webcast up. And usually I react pretty fast to those comments. So have a good day. Bye bye.